All right, hi everybody. I just to introduce myself, I am Connie B. Dowell. I am an author, an editor, and a coach, and I have been helping writers in one way or another since 2010, which is quite a long time now. I say it out loud. It makes me feel a little bit old, but maybe seasoned is the better word. And this is actually for those who are just stumbling across this video on YouTube, because that's one of the places I'm going to post it. This is an episode of my ongoing podcast for writers called Book Echoes. So do be sure to check the notes below to check out and listen to previous episodes of the podcast, other resources that I've got available, etc. But you can also listen to this without prior knowledge of the podcast at all. So it is a presentation that can stand alone. But if you like it and would like to learn more, go ahead and do so. So this is an adaptation of a presentation I made a while ago. So most of my podcasts don't have a video, but this one does. This episode does, rather. And a lot of writers have questions about the editing process, and especially about finding and hiring a freelance editor. And as a freelance editor and as an author myself who has worked with freelance editors, I want to give you guys a little bit of the basics of what you need to know about working with a freelance editor, different levels of editing, and what you can do to get your manuscript in good standing before you pay for an edit. Now, just so that those who are going through traditional publishing know, this is about the freelance process. And some authors who are pursuing traditional publishing do contract with freelance editors for various reasons to get their manuscript in tip-top shape, but it's not a requirement to submit to traditional publishers, because of course they have their own in-house editors and their process may look quite a bit different than this. So please don't think this is the process for all editing everywhere. This is just generalities of freelance editing specifically. So to say generality specifically, but anyway, so it is the freelance editing process. And let's dive into what editors do, because writers like to throw around the word edit and editor to mean a lot of different things. But there are certain levels of editing and specific specialities of editing that mean specific things. So editing covers a lot. It could cover story structure and character development. It can cover things like scene descriptions, incorporating backstory or research, organization and presentation in nonfiction. It can cover sentence level things like structure of sentences, dialogue, rhyme and meter for rhyming picture books, grammar, punctuation, style, and fact checking. And that is a lot of stuff. But all of those things are unlikely to be done by a single person in a single step. So let's break down from the broadest, from the kind of first level of editing to later and later levels. The first level of editing is called developmental, and that is structural big picture feedback. Feedback on elements of plot, character, organization, feedback on elements of scope and depth in nonfiction. Developmental editing is editing that should be done before any other layers of editing are added on top, because if you're going to change things about plot, about character, about these big picture elements, you want to do it before you're refining the sentences and tweaking the grammar, because otherwise you've done work that you would then have to undo. So that is where developmental editing comes into play. So if you are going to hire a developmental editor, that should be your first stage of editing. Now, copy and line editing. And publishing houses often, not always, but often do break this into two separate stages. But a lot of freelance editors who contract with especially independent authors, will combine these two, and I like to combine these two together. So copy and line editing do things like sentence level changes, looking on the sentence structure and the rhythm of the words, fact checking, making sure that this is period appropriate, if it's historical, or other little facts that come up. Is that accurate? Style, rhyme and meter where applicable, like I mentioned for rhyming picture books. The copy line editing stage is where I would be looking at rhyme and meter. And grammar and punctuation are also there as well. So copy and line editing can do a lot and be a pretty labor intensive stage. Now let's look at the difference between a copy edit, and I don't want to put anybody's writing on the spot, so I am actually going to use a passage of my own writing. And this was the first and then the second piece. So originally it read, "The roar of an engine coming to life drew me from my novel. I raced to my bedroom window and pushed aside the lacy curtains in time to see the retreat of a dusty truck marked U.S. Mail. It was here. My heart thumped. It was here. I bolted downstairs, my shoes banging against the steps." And while not terrible, it could definitely use some tightening up. So let's see how the copy edited version, let's tighten this up a little bit. "The roar of an engine pierced the afternoon quiet. I dropped the novel on the desk, raced to my bedroom window, and pushed aside the lacy curtains. A dusty truck marked U.S. Mail idled on the street outside the house. My heart thumped. I bolted downstairs, my shoes banging against the steps." And so I've changed these lines a little bit because the first original line, "The roar of an engine coming to life drew me from my novel." It's hard to kind of visually picture that. It's not as striking. It's like starts with a sound and then it's drawing. So is it visual? Is it auditory? Instead of piercing the quiet, which is I felt like was a better, and it's also just a better structure. And so I've tightened up the middle bit as well and made it a little bit more active. We don't have the same repetition. It was here. It was here. Don't even really need to say it was here. But see, that's the difference between that raw unedited version and then just tightening things up, making it a little smoother, and avoiding kind of obvious or unnecessary stuff. Now, let's move on to the third stage of editing, which is proofreading. And that is the lightest level of editing. It is a final pass through the manuscript that's already been edited to make sure that errors haven't been introduced in the editing process, because editing tweaks a whole lot of stuff. You can see the big difference between that first and second passage in my copy editing example. And so that's a lot of tweaking and lots of little tweaks over the entirety of a manuscript. Even a very detailed copy editor could still accidentally introduce some errors. And that's what proofreading is for. Also, if you are, an independent author, or if you get the chance to really do lots of accepting and rejecting of copy edit changes, then you might accidentally be introducing some errors. So that is what proofreading is all about. And recasting sentences. It says no recasting sentences here. And you might be wondering, what's recasting? Well, recasting is what I did just a moment ago with this copy editing example. I'm rephrasing things. You're not doing that in proofreading. You're really just looking for errors, things that, the wrong word, missing punctuation. Some proofreaders might touch grammar and some might not. I do, but within a little bit of reason. But generally at the proofreading stage, it is the lightest touch, just making sure everything is proof perfect. Now, in a traditional publishing house, proofreading has traditionally been done, not the way that a lot of independent authors would do it. It would be literally looking at proof copies, either physical copies or nowadays digital copies. They're literally the proof copies of the book. But if you are contracting a proofreader as on a freelance basis, just as an author yourself, then this will probably be done in Microsoft Word or Google Docs. All right, let's talk about the logistics of the editing. And I just hinted at that a little bit a moment ago, referencing those two programs. Most editors do prefer to work with Word using the track changes functions, but some, and an increasing number, do use Google Docs as well, because it also has like functions where you can track the changes, you can accept and reject things, and you can add comments. Very few editors nowadays use those old-fashioned proofreading marks because everything is digital. We don't need to mark up traditional manuscripts anymore. Now, there's no set formatting for how your pages have to look. That's a question I often get from potential clients or just from authors I'm talking to, is how do I format my pages to go to my freelance editor? And some of them may have a specific way, but I think by and large, most of us don't really care. You can have it any font you want, you can have it double spaced, you can have it single spaced, because again, you're working digitally, so we can increase the size and make it look easy on the eyes, however we want to do. And also because it's not set formatting, it's important to know your word count. There are some freelance editors who do have set formatting so that they can charge by the page and base their pricing by the page. But a lot of us, an increasing number of us, myself included, we price based on word count. And so it's important to know your word count, go into Microsoft Word or go into Google Docs, and you can look it up really easily. And that's how you can calculate out, once you get a base price from an editor, a base quote from an editor, to know generally how much it's going to cost. So let's have a look at track changes for those who are unfamiliar. And I'm just going to be using Word here. So you can see here's this test paragraph. You can add a comment and it highlights over here. If you add words in, it adds in this red underline, and it also crosses words out, and then they're in red as well. So finding track changes, you just go up here on this top bar and look for the words track changes, and click that button, go under, click the track changes button, and that will keep track of what you've changed. It's really as simple as that. Now, finding a good editor. There are lots of ways to find a good editor. You can ask author buddies. You can ask them who they've used, and word of mouth is probably the very best recommendation that you'll get. You can also ask in social media groups or chats. There are lots and lots and lots of social media groups and chats for writers, and they all have lots of experience, and people are generally very willing to share information. You can also look at blogs or podcasts from editors like me. Hello. And you can check the acknowledgements or copyright pages on books that you like, especially independently published books. Traditionally published books would, acknowledge their traditional publishing editor, who may or may not be open for freelance work. But if you have a book that you like, that was independently published, you can probably figure out from somewhere in the front or back matter who did the editing, or you could ask the author. And once you find somebody, you look at testimonials on their websites or on their listing, and ask if they'll do sample edits. A lot of us will do a sample edit if it's applicable. I know I do that. And that way you can see the difference between the levels of work. Now, some editors do have permission from clients to post like before and after pictures of their work, but I find that that's increasingly less common. It's not something that I want to do because I want to keep my clients' first drafts private. I don't want to post it anywhere. I haven't asked them to do that, but I do sample edits so that you can get a sense of whether we be working well together. Now, know that there are lots of sites out there that you can find freelancers on, and they do save you time. They do make it very easy and safe on the user, but they take a cut. So sites like Reedsy, Upwork, or Fiverr is a place where you can find freelancers, but they take a pretty big cut. And so they're, it doesn't necessarily a bad sign that an editor doesn't have a profile on one of those sites. And it's not my favorite place to find work because they take such a huge cut. Fiverr in particular tends to attract more low quality professionals and more low quality jobs from the editor side. So I really wouldn't recommend that one if you're going to go with one of those sites. But regardless of where you find your editor, contracts keep you both safe. So your editor may have a standard contract that they use. I have a standard contract that I adapt depending on the situation, but I'm also willing to look at a contract that a client wants to bring to the table. Now, pay securely. So make sure that they have a professional way to pay, something like PayPal or Stripe, etc. Venmo is becoming a little bit less unprofessional. I have heard in editors groups of people using it as a backup option if they're working with a client in a country where they don't have access to a lot of these digital payment tools. So that is a backup option, but generally I would say, don't just Venmo someone money. Make sure that they have a professional way to do this, especially because a lot of these will also allow you to dispute if you're not getting what you're paying for. If they don't deliver, the editor just disappears. You can write PayPal and say, hey, I paid a deposit and then I never got my work. And they can kind of maybe make something happen along those lines. But so yeah, definitely don't make a friends and family transfer on PayPal. That's a clear unprofessional sign. It shows that the editor is trying to avoid the PayPal fee, because if you provide a service over PayPal and use that as your payment processor, then PayPal does take a small cut. And if you're trying to avoid the fee like that, they're skirting PayPal's rules. So it's a red flag for me. All right, so I'll take a sip and then let's look at what to do pre-editing, what kind of self-editing you can do before you start looking for a freelance editor. Oh, I'm talking a lot today. All right. So first, get your plot and story in order. Understand, and if you are struggling with plot structure, then I recommend starting with a basic 3-act structure. There are more complicated structures we can get into, but 3-act structure will not steer you wrong if you want to start learning about structure. So make sure that your story has a beginning. That's a beginning sets things up. It establishes the main problem. It has a middle where you are firmly in the new world of the story. Things start to get more complicated, and a B story develops. Now, what's a B story? A B story is this major subplot, basically. And usually that is a relationship plot. It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship plot, but that's a common misconception. It's a relationship plot, so I have to give them a love interest. Not necessarily. It might be a relationship plot between a parent and a child, between siblings, between friends, between your coworkers who maybe they don't like each other at the beginning and then they like each other by the end and they're friends. And so it can be any kind of a relationship plot. If a relationship plot is what you want to have your B story be. So then an end, a lead up to the climax of the story where the day is won or lost. We have answered the question from the beginning of the story. And finally, the last scene or two is what's called the denouement, and it wraps up all those loose ends and leaves the reader feeling satisfied. So plot versus story is another thing to understand. And plot is external. What physical things are happening in the story versus story being internal. What changes are happening in the character? What does the character need to learn? Now I'm referencing a lot of really big stuff, and I'm also going to include some links in the in the bottom here or in the show notes if you are listening to this on the podcast to get a little bit more information. So plot external to the character, story internal to your protagonist. And both of those should have a great deal of shifting and changing. So while there is, a challenge and a question to happen externally to create a plot, you also need to have some change, usually internal change in the protagonist as the plot continues. And those two things are all wrapped up in each other. So the story problem should also have some try-fail cycles. It's not much of a story if you've got a problem and you solve it right away. The protagonist needs to try and fail and try and fail, but always kind of be failing forward until they finally succeed in the climax. Another thing to keep in mind is this is not a hard and fast rule. People call it the rule of three. It's not really a rule, but it is a trope that shows up in storytelling over and over again, and it's pretty hardwired, at least into kind of Western storytelling culture, is that things tend to happen in threes. So if you are feeling like your patterns are off or something, maybe you've only got 2 attempts and it needs to be 3. Or maybe you've got too much of something happening and you pare it down to 3. So things tend to happen in threes. Now, developing your character arc. So you know that most stories have that internal change, which is usually within the protagonist. And to try and develop that arc, you need to ask yourself a few questions. What does your character learn through the story? What truth did they discover, or do they lose? Because they might discover a truth, like they might begin as a very hardened person, and life has been tough on them, and they don't believe in opening themselves up to other people. And then they discover that not everyone is terrible, and that it's okay to trust somebody by the end of the story. But they can also lose a truth. They can also learn something that is negative and untrue, as they can go down a darker path. And it's terrible movies, but it's a shame, because this could have been really, if executed well, could have been really great. Is the story of Darth Vader going from Anakin Skywalker to Darth Vader. If it had been executed better, could have been really powerful, because he is losing a truth. He is becoming worse over the course of those 3 movies. So it doesn't have to always be a positive change, but it should be a change. And if you're thinking about ways to develop that character arc, ways to challenge this character, what events could happen in your novel that make this one person into a different person, think about that change and who they are in the beginning versus who you want them to be in the end. And a lot of plot experts like to say to push you to think, okay, do you need you need a really big change? So you decide who you want them to be at the end, and then put them in the opposite pole at the beginning. And I know why they say that. They say that to push you to think bigger. But you also need to consider whether you need a big change or a small one, because not every genre is going to need a huge, big change. And I say that as someone who writes mystery. And mystery novel protagonists don't change dramatically from book to book. Think about Hercule Poirot. Is he dramatically different in The Mysterious Affair at Styles versus in, but when we finally get to the end, The Labors of Hercule, do you have, I think that's the title of the last one, but he doesn't change dramatically from book to book. And you kind of don't want him to. You want him to still be that weird, quirky little Belgian detective. You don't want him to change dramatically. And so when you might be having a story where there's dramatic changes, but if you have an episodic kind of story, a series that could go on and on and on, think about smaller changes. Think less like a movie level of change and more like a TV episode. Again, TV episodes, those characters don't change dramatically from episode to episode, or even too dramatically, of course, across the course of one season. But over multiple seasons, if you've got a TV show you've watched for years and years, those characters have probably changed a bit. It's just small incremental changes over time. Now, as I mentioned before, plot and story go hand in hand. So thinking about those character changes will help you develop events for your plot, because you have to think about what kinds of things could happen to push that person into change. So just for a moment, let's talk about mentor texts. And this is a phrase that comes from children's publishing, especially thrown around by picture book writers, but I think it is also beneficial for anyone who writes with any age, is to think about mentor texts, reading books to learn how to handle a topic or situation that you want to write about. If you've got a question, like, I don't know how to depict this, look for other books that do something similar. If you're like, I write this first person protagonist who's this kind of weird and I'm not sure, look for more books and read about it. So this is something you can do before you start to even self-edit and revise. If there's bits of your story that you have a question about, read other things that are out there and see how they did it and what tricks you might be able to apply to your own manuscript. Not copying the plot, but just see how they handled it. This is also why you want texts plural, not just one. So then you can read multiple varieties of the same kind of thing that you're trying to do and learn how to do it in your own way. So for further reading on structure, and I will include these in the show notes as well, and for those watching on YouTube, in the notes just below this video, look at Lisa Cron's Wire for Story. Kate and Weiland's books and podcasts are also really good resources. Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, and as well as Jessica Brody's kind of adaptation Save the Cat for Novelists are also very good resources. And for children's authors specifically, I recommend Darcy Pattinson's book and blog, Books and Blog. They're all very good. All right, now for children's authors specifically, let's talk about knowing your genre and age group conventions. So I guess not specifically for children's authors, for children's and adult authors, know your genre and age group conventions. So know these genres and subgenres and categories that you want to write in. Each of them have specific requirements. So a picture book looks generally a certain way. It has generally a certain number of words in it. A sci-fi book for adults generally has a certain number of words in it. And that is something, it's not hard and fast. There are always books that break the mold. And independent authors in particular have a lot of leeway, but you kind of want to look generally like it fits into something somewhere. So the link shouldn't be too far off the norm. You want to make sure you meet reader expectations for the genre. You can always push the genre, but you want to know what those expectations are. The tropes, the kinds of situations and characters and things that typically come up in that genre, and the market. Who are your readership? What do they like? Where do they like to hang out? What are they interested in? All of these are good things to know before you start revising. Honestly, before you start writing, if you can. And if you are looking at the list and going, I don't know where my book fits, I don't understand, my book doesn't fit anywhere, it straddles all genres, it's for all people, I promise you, it's not. If you try to please absolutely everybody, you're not going to please anybody. And even if your book is like really genre straddling, it's best to try and position it as whatever it is closest to, because you've got to market it in some way. And it's tough. I know it's tough as a creative person. You want to be totally unique, but it can also be freeing to realize that there is no such thing as totally unique. They say there's it's only 7 types of stories or 6 types of stories, depending on who you talk to, and it's how you tell it that is unique to you. So let's talk about sentence level stuff instead of this big picture bits. So for sentence work, what you can do to make that better before you hand it over to an editor is try and make things shorter. That's the big difference that you probably saw between my own edits of my own work, is that things often, there was lots of repetition, long sentences, just trying to make things shorter. You can usually eliminate words from something. Varying your sentence length is also important. You don't want lots of short, choppy sentences or lots of long sentences. You want to kind of mix it up. And when you see a good writer using lots of one type of sentence or another, they're usually doing so for effect. Short, choppy sentences feel faster, so it can speed you up through a scene, and the longer sentences have a more relaxed feeling. So longer sentences for description, short, choppy sentences for action. So in terms of other self-editing at the sentence level, these are some watch out words. Look out for was or is, especially followed by a word ending in ing. I was watching, I was jumping, I was cooking. See if you can just make it, I watched, I jumped, I cooked. A lot of times you can trim down that sentence and make it feel punchier and just less words. Look out for that. It's also an overused word. Read the sentence without the that and see if you actually need that in the sentence. Also, look out for things like started. I repeated it again here. Started or began or started. So yeah, started and began. A lot of times you don't need to say you started to do this. You began to do this. You just did it. I started to make the lunches. I made the lunches. And the same image gets across, but we don't need all the throat clearing started. Now, adverbs and adjectives. A lot of folks do like to say, I'll get rid of adverbs, but get rid of adjectives. Sometimes you need them, but sometimes you can, just by looking for them, you can come up with punchier verbs instead, or punchier words instead. He was very old. No, he was ancient. See, ancient is so much more powerful than very old. Very anything is often a sign that you need a better adjective there. So watch out for those just overuse and just see where you can make it punchier. So also watch out for seeing, saw, depending on your tense, feel, felt, hear, heard. Those are filter words. Things are filtering through your character's perspective. He saw the bird flying overhead. The bird flew overhead. We're in his perspective, so we don't need to hear the see and saw, just make it happen. So for those of you who are writing children's books and writing in rhyme, please study your poetry. Understand the pattern of rhyming sounds. That's what's called rhyme scheme. Understand the meter, that is the syllables and stress. The most common meter that you probably have heard of in English classes is iambic pentameter. What that means is you have a metrical foot called an iamb. That is 2 syllables. Iamb is actually iambic, so iamb, 1 unstressed and 1 stressed. And pentameter means that there are 5 metrical feet to a line. So that means there are 5 things that are 5 repetitions of that unstressed stressed in a line. And it's the most common metrical foot in English. It's closest to natural English speech, which is why it's the most common one that you probably heard of, but there are lots of others. And I recommend picking up a book on poetry and studying them and understanding them if you really want to write in rhyme. And also understanding, the difference between rhyme and slant rhyme. Slant rhyme is like an almost rhyme. If it doesn't quite rhyme, and sometimes you can get away with that, but try not to over rely on things that almost rhyme but don't quite. Now, in terms of rhyme in picture books, number of syllables is often more crucial for reading the line than being exact on the rhyme or on the specific metrical beat involved. It is more obvious when the number of syllables between your lines, if you are normally writing, if the most of the manuscript is in one specific, number of syllables per line, it's more obvious when one of them is off in that area than when something is off on the rhyme or the metrical beat. So now the biggest thing that anybody can do before they start to look for or hire a freelance editor is to get some beta reading and a critique group to look at your manuscript. So a beta reader is someone who is kind of reading that book after you have done your first pass self-edit of it. And so you can exchange any manuscripts with other authors, you can join a local critique group, or you can join an online critique group, and you can also test out your book with your target audience. So you can get feedback from other writers who are familiar with the genre, who are familiar with writing. You can also get feedback from readers who read your genre or read your category and see what they think as well. And finally, I recommend everybody read their manuscript out loud. You can also have a computer read it out loud to you. There's a read aloud feature in Google Docs. There's a read aloud feature in Word. And that will catch a lot of little things that you maybe don't notice. It's not quite as good as speaking it out loud in terms of catching sentences that are hard to say, but the computer reading it out loud to you will say every single word that is written, and it will not say words that you meant to type but didn't. Whereas if you are reading this out loud to yourself, you know what you meant to say, and so you are apt to kind of mentally correct it without realizing as you read it. But the computer will read only what's on the page, and that really helps catch errors. Then finally, you can also change the font as you read through. And just that change will make you a little bit less familiar with the manuscript. Your brain has to work a little harder as you read it, because it feels a little less familiar, and it will help you catch errors that way as well. And that was it. So hope this has been helpful. I'm going to stop that share. Hello again. And so I hope this has been helpful. If you are looking for an editor, I have some openings in August. If you're listening to this right as it's coming out. If not, then I can't speak for future openings, but head on over to bookechoes.com/services and see what service is right for you. You can give me, send me a message and we can set up, if applicable, a sample edit, or you can see some testimonials from past clients and see if that works out for you. I also offer coaching for folks who are maybe a little bit stuck in some of those early stages or who want to work on their marketing and promotion platform. And so that is it for this time. Hope to see you back in some future videos.